It's amazing that even though there are so many avenues worth exploring in Code Geass, including the Geass itself, the Geass Order, the ending, the Stats Massacre, the Ragnarok connection, the Knights of the Round, subplots that were abandoned, the Nightmare Frames, the extended universe, and so forth, that people would rather speculate on Lelouch's love life, which is especially interesting since Code Geass isn't even a romance anime. I mean, this topic is still my most watched video on the channel, so I figured it's time to make a follow-up video. I mean, a lot has changed since then. One of the biggest is that my audio quality now was way better than back then. But thank you for all those who kept telling me to improve it. With the video itself, you, my awesome audience, mentioned many interesting points in the comments that were things I left out, that I forgot about, or just didn't even know were a thing at the time. I also learned new information and gained new perspectives through recent rewatches of the series. So naturally, I would like to share those ideas with you. A couple of disclaimers before we begin. I'm not going to rehash old arguments from the first video if I have no new perspectives on them. People did bring up interesting insights on Euphemia, but there's not much there, so I won't be covering it. This video is meant to be an analysis of the original anime only, not the alternative timeline. I might bring up the alternative timeline if it's done for comparison reasons. Many of you have argued about C2 and Lelouch's relationship in the films, which isn't wrong, but it's off topic. And once again, this is only discussing things from Lelouch's perspective. This is not a video on who would make a better couple in general or how the women feel about Lelouch. The video is focused on analyzing Lelouch's actions and his feelings towards the three main love interests. Just like before, I'm only going to focus on the three main love interests, Shirley, Kallen, and C2 in that order. So with that in mind, join me once again as we answer the question, who did Lelouch love? Let's start with Shirley. So many of you were quick to point out that Psycho disguised as Lelouch wasn't the Lelouch that Shirley talked to during this scene. That was an honest mistake, and I appreciate the correction. Now, while I was arguing that this was a one-sided relationship, I conveniently forgot one big piece of information. Of the three main love interests, Shirley was the only character that Lelouch actually went out with. I'm of course not talking about the alternative anime timeline because that's another thing altogether. So does this mean that Lelouch loved Shirley? Well, that's certainly a good possibility. I didn't get the impression that he wasn't being genuine during their brief time as a couple. It would have been nice to have gotten more scenes, but what are you gonna do, I guess? There is a caveat that goes along with this. Lelouch also considered killing Shirley over using Geass on her. This was something he discussed during the epilogue of Stage 14. Now, people can change their minds on something like this, but I did find it interesting that Lelouch considered himself soft for not killing Shirley, and not due to the fact that he might have had feelings for her. This was especially odd because he said earlier that he regrets losing Shirley, citing that her smile saved him. Very odd indeed. I have two perspectives on this. Either the two cancel each other out, with Lelouch not sure how he feels about her, or Lelouch developed feelings for Shirley as the story progressed. I'm going to go with the latter. Now, another counterpoint that was brought up was that Lelouch ignoring her had more meaning than what I originally said. He was trying to protect her from everything going on. And I agree with this, but I wish this wasn't shown in a comical way. I mean, even the manga treated the situation with more respect. Now, just because Lelouch's reasons for ignoring her were noble, that doesn't change the fact that it led to awful things that happened. His desire to keep her apart is what led to her death. There was definitely more going on here, but the outcome was the same. And Lelouch should have known better after what happened with Mao. Another thing I downplayed was Lelouch's reaction to Shirley's death. My initial interpretation of this was incorrect. I would now argue that Lelouch's reaction to Shirley's death was more intense than when he thought Nellie had died. This is arguably the most emotions he's ever shown in the series. There are other times where Lelouch does get emotional, but nothing on this level. The raw feelings Lelouch expressed were intense. It was as if something was ripped from his body. If his reactions to Shirley's death were on the same level as Nellie, or even beyond that, then that tells you how important Shirley was to him. If that's true, then Lelouch not saying he loved her didn't matter, because the actions here spoke louder than any words could. And of course, her death motivated his actions to destroy the Geass Order. On a lighter note, someone in the comments made an interesting observation about the kiss between Lelouch and Shirley. In that case, he kissed her back with passion, something that didn't happen with either C2 or Kallen. I'm not sure what that means in the grand scheme, but it is an interesting observation for sure. She was also the first person Lelouch thinks about before he dies. There's more significance to this than you might have realized. Lelouch's memories before his death are in descending chronological order. That's why you see Dietar's death and Lelouch using Geass on Schneisel immediately following Shirley. But that memory of Shirley occurred earlier in the story, so why would they break the order just for that? What's even more interesting is that as far as I know, that footage of Shirley never appeared in the anime. It's similar to the one from stage 1, but Shirley had a different expression in that scene. I believe this memory comes from turn 5, where we see Shirley doing something similar from Suzaku's perspective. So I have two interesting takeaways from this. One, they created a brand new animation of Shirley for Lelouch's memories, and 2, it's the first thing shown despite it breaking the order in which Lelouch's memories appear. That can't be a coincidence. So with these things in mind, I think Lelouch genuinely cared about Shirley, but never could devote enough time to her given his higher priorities. I wonder how Lelouch would have balanced his already complicated life had Raoul not killed Shirley and the two continued dating in the series. I also wonder if Lelouch might have had stronger feelings for Shirley, but never fully realized it until it was too late. As I discussed in other videos on this topic, if the circumstances where Lelouch received Geass hadn't happened, then they would have become a couple sooner and probably gotten married in the future, where Shirley gets to have all those mini Lelouches that she imagined. Unfortunately, that's not how things turned out. I of course shipped these two, and there's lots of proof now that their romantic feelings were mutual. Upon rewatching the series, I completely understand why people think Lelouch loved Shirley the most. After all, this was the only relationship of the three that became canon in the original anime. Okay, next, let's talk about Kallen and Lelouch. Many of you have brought up interesting arguments on why Lelouch loved Kallen. The problem was, most of it was arguing from Kallen's perspective, and as I said, this video is analyzing things from Lelouch's perspective. So these arguments might have some validity from Kallen's point of view, but not so much from Lelouch's. But I understand. Lelouch doesn't express his feelings much, so you have to make some assumptions here. Although I would argue that some of these assumptions were quite a reach. Now, when it comes to the relationship in general, I'm more convinced now that this is the only true one-sided relationship of the three. I can say with some level of certainty that Lelouch doesn't have any romantic feelings for her. He definitely cares for her as a friend and a fellow soldier, but that's about it. One thing I noticed recently is that Lelouch never follows up on anything that occurred between them. This of course was the opposite when it came to C2 or Shirley. Kallen is usually the one that has to bring this stuff up again. Let's go through some examples. Lelouch doesn't bring up what happened at the Shinjuku ghetto where he tried to force himself on her. You would think we get a scene later on of him apologizing or explaining his actions. Lelouch never brings up what he meant by,
Kallen, when this is over, will you then return with me to Ashford?
He could have referenced it when talking to Kallen when they spoke on the intercom following her capture. Of course, he would do it in a vague sense, so only she would know what he means. He also had the opportunity to bring that up when they were in the elevator together in turn 19, which didn't happen. And of course, Lelouch never explains what he meant by "you have to live," even after Kallen asked him. A big theme with these two is inferring from what we see and what we don't see on screen. And not seeing Lelouch follow up on many of these possible romantic encounters says a lot. Let's rehash the moments where Lelouch teases Kallen, specifically when she is naked or basically naked. Originally I said these could have been seen as playful teasing, but it's hard for me to feel that way anymore. Here are some interesting observations I've noticed recently in regards to these scenes that has changed my perspective on them. Lelouch doesn't tease Shirley or C2 like that. Now granted, there aren't many moments with Shirley for this to happen, but in C2's case, there are many times where she isn't wearing much clothing and yet he says nothing. And we know he's not afraid to tease her. I mean, I've covered it in several videos. Continuing on, the only reason why Lelouch's comments are acceptable is because Kallen lets them go. I'm glad he put a coat on Kallen after humiliating her, but a thank you would have gone a long way. He knows she gets embarrassed for things like this, so he must have realized that wearing the bunny costume wasn't easy. But you get nothing from him. And in the other case, Lelouch didn't have to say anything. Suzaku, by contrast, didn't mention it at all when he pinned her down. But the most interesting of these observations is that Lelouch doesn't compliment Kallen's body. Someone argued that he complimented her body in turn 7, which isn't true because Lelouch literally did not say that, and he was just talking about women in general. But it does bring up an interesting point. Why doesn't he do this? He's seen her enough times now that if he had feelings for her, why not say it? Now, obviously, just because he doesn't compliment her in this way, that doesn't mean there's no romantic feelings, but it would have definitely gone a long way to show that there were, since we don't get much of anything else. They could have wrote it where Lelouch's attraction was initially only physical, but evolves into something else, but instead, we get basically nothing. In contrast to Shirley, Lelouch was disappointed when she didn't kiss him. From a certain point of view, Lelouch is obviously physically attracted to her if he was hoping for a kiss. Now there's one thing I like to circle back to, which was when Lelouch tells Kallen to live. He also told Shirley to live in turn 13, so maybe that's proof he had romantic feelings for Kallen, but it is a bit of a stretch. Even Kallen only speculated that Lelouch was trying to protect her and not because of mutual romantic feelings. In my first video, many pointed out that my take on Lelouch not saving Kallen in turn 10 was wrong, and to some extent, those points are valid. Lelouch is clearly upset after Shinkai takes Kallen prisoner in turn 10, and he promises her that he will save her. Despite D-Tard advising against it, Lelouch goes forward with the attempt to save Kallen. It unfortunately doesn't work out, which forces him to put the rescue on hold. I think given the circumstances, he definitely tried everything he could to save Kallen as if she was Nunnally. Now, while I do agree that Lelouch had concern and desire to save Kallen, but I don't agree that means it was a sign of romantic feelings for her. He cared about her, but still it was only as a friend. But the bigger problem here is that Lelouch seems to have forgotten about Kallen following her capture. There's a scene in turn 16 where the UFN was ratified, with Lelouch declaring that the Black Knights would liberate Japan. In the same scene, Rakshata mentions they could also save Kallen, and Ogi responds with, "Oh yeah, you're right." It's as if he forgot she was captured to begin with. I can't say for sure if Lelouch would have reacted in the same way, but it does show that Kallen's rescue wasn't discussed in a while, probably because it became less and less of a priority. Otherwise, why would Ogi have responded that way to Rakshata's comments? Also, it should be noted that only Rakshata talks about this and not Lelouch. He doesn't even mention rescuing Kallen during the mission briefing. While it's true that Lelouch gave her the label of Priority 3 during the mission, he doesn't ask Sayako or Rollo about her status. If Lelouch loved Kallen, then her rescue would be a higher priority and something that would be on his mind all the time, and yet neither of those things happen. Let's move on to another topic, which is the idea that Lelouch lied to Kallen about Geass. Someone argued that Lelouch didn't lie to Kallen when it came to using Geass on her. Yes, that's correct. Kallen's mind was her own. At no point did Lelouch use Geass on her to force her to join the Black Knights. But I was talking about using Geass on her in general, which Lelouch was not honest about. Kallen asked a loaded question, and Lelouch only answered a part of it. Now, another idea presented in the comments was that the two have some great interaction in the series, but this leads to a major problem, which is that Kallen didn't have a big impact on Lelouch despite these interactions. I already brought up how Lelouch barely follows up on stuff, but there are also examples where Lelouch should have acted differently had Kallen meant that much to him. Following his call to Rivals while in the Shinkiro, he asked Kallen to take care of C2. He is of course talking to himself here. If Lelouch loved Kallen, then this would be a great time to say it, because after all, he's alone in the Nightmare Frame. I also find it interesting that in that same statement, he expresses more concern for C2 than Kallen. In turn 22, after Lelouch says goodbye to Kallen, he doesn't seem emotionally upset to see her again in turn 24. Kallen, by contrast, clearly is. Perhaps that's because Lelouch is playing the role of the evil Emperor Lelouch, but he was about to have a heartfelt moment with C2 though. There are many more examples of this. I think the problem here is that Lelouch never realized Kallen had feelings for him until the Requiem, but I think he realized she heavily depended on him, but just never in that way. What I can conclude about these two is that Lelouch respects Kallen as a friend and a soldier in arms. He gave her the Gurren and put her in charge of the Zero Squad. When Kallen had doubts about staying in the Black Knights, Lelouch was there for her to talk through them. He even offered her the choice to leave if she wanted to, and when she was captured in turn 10, he was visibly upset about it. There's even a part in turn 19 where he sacrificed himself so she could live, and I'm sure he appreciates the fact that Kallen is always there for him. But none of these things change the fact that this still was a one-sided relationship. Kallen's actions don't have a big impact on Lelouch. There are moments where Lelouch simply forgets about Kallen, and he doesn't show any romantic feelings towards Kallen in the form of flirting or compliment her body in any way, or even just compliment her in general, outside of those small examples I listed, which are debatable at best, even though he had plenty of chances to do so. And no, that scene in turn 7 does not count. The show doesn't dedicate enough time for Lelouch to develop his feelings for Kallen or to outright show them, which I think was done on purpose. Yet Shirley and Lelouch, who had less scenes than Kallen and Lelouch, had more time to develop a strong, albeit brief, relationship. I can understand why people ship these two, but this is still a one-sided relationship. Let's again talk about the last possible love interest, the mysterious C2. Now there's one major problem with this relationship that is somewhat off topic but needs to be addressed. There is a huge age gap between them. C2 is an immortal who's over 500 years old, and Lelouch is either 17 or 18 depending if it's season 1 or season 2 of Code Geass. I won't deny that a relationship like this is creepy and possibly illegal depending on Britannian law. But I don't know Britannian rules for this kind of stuff. It's probably a do as I say but not as I do considering how immoral Charles was. Now here is why the age gap doesn't bother me, because it doesn't play a role in their relationship. C2 doesn't take advantage of Lelouch as a typical cougar would do with a younger guy, or in a more disturbing case when older women teachers take advantage of their teenage students. She doesn't flirt with him in that way at all. Now there was that one scene in stage 13, but that was in context to Geass and is not a good example of this. Another thing to consider is that their relationship is one of equals. We see this when they discuss important topics or when they tease each other. C2 being significantly older doesn't play a major role in their relationship. It does play a role when she acts as a mentor when giving him advice. Although I would even argue that Lelouch gives her just as much advice as she gives to him. Now in terms of taking advantage of each other, I would argue that Lelouch has probably taken more advantage of C2, like when he asked for her help in stage 13 or in turn 14. I always saw this relationship in the same way as Shepard and Liara from Mass Effect. It's true that Liara will outlive Shepard, but she can still form a bond with him, and the age difference didn't matter. If you didn't know that C2 was an immortal, then you wouldn't have guessed it by how the two interact. Let's go through some other issues raised in the comments. Lelouch forced C2 to partake in the Geass Order massacre. I think that opinion might come across as extreme. Sure, Lelouch asked her to prove that she's loyal to him, but this is C2 we're talking about. If she didn't want to do it, then it wouldn't have happened. She also seemed happy at the end of their conversation, so she was giving off mixed signals here. I got the impression that she wanted to partake in the destruction of the Geass Order as a redemption for her sins. But sure, this is a valid point. Pressuring someone to do something isn't a sign of love. It doesn't bother me as much, but it is an understandable critique. Now in the first video I discussed their interaction in turn 24, but I didn't go over the one in turn 15, so let's do that. While in Siege World, Lelouch was able to experience C2's memories. It's there he learned about her true wish. Before Charles could take her code and end her life, Lelouch pleads with her to not do this. He promises to fulfill her true wish and help her smile again. This would be an important piece of their relationship going forward. In their final interaction in the series, Lelouch promises to come back, which C2 said would make her smile again. He never did, which is something she knew, which is why I always thought this part was kind of odd to me, but the point still stands. I've already covered this relationship in at least 4 videos, so not to be redundant, I'm going to be redundant and summarize it in a few sentences. Lelouch and C2's relationship evolved from a one-sided business arrangement to genuinely caring about each other. C2 figured that Lelouch would be a fascinating guy, but had no idea to this extent. She had never dealt with someone quite like him, a person who puts up with her BS and gives it right back to her, someone who can provide a perspective she hadn't thought about, an individual who showed genuine concern for an immortal witch, willing to become her demon. So C2 is still the one I think Lelouch loved the most, but in second place is definitely Shirley, and Kallen, despite being in third place, is not even close when compared to the other two. Now, plot twist. There's actually a fourth option, which many of you suggested. No, not Suzaku, and definitely not Nunnally, at least not romantically.
That's disgusting!
That idea is that Lelouch didn't love anyone, and the rationale for this is he was so focused on the rebellion that he didn't really have time for romance. And there is some validity to this general idea. In the official art book for Code Geass, it states that Lelouch isn't in love with C2, and with Kallen, we've established there's nothing going on there either. But his relationship with Shirley disproves this. For one, the two went out, so that alone shows that Lelouch felt something for her. And as I mentioned before, his reaction to her death indicates she was more than a good friend. Lelouch wept for her like he would have if she was Nunnally. So we can argue with C2 and Kallen, but not with Shirley. Thus, this argument doesn't hold water. And with that, I want to now hear your new thoughts on this age-old question. Who do you think Lelouch loved the most, or just loved at all? Let me know in the comments what other couples in anime you'd like me to cover in the future, even ones not in Code Geass.
No, anything but that.
If this is your first time on the channel, make sure to watch the original video where I went over this topic.